The snow had been falling since dawn, soft and persistent, the kind that muffles the world and makes everything feel like it exists inside a snow globe. Each flake drifted down with a whisper, settling on the windowsills and the bare branches of the old oak tree that stood sentinel in the front yard. Inside the house, the warmth wrapped around everyone like a familiar blanket, the kind that smells faintly of cedar and cinnamon and all the Christmases that had come before. The living room glowed with the light of 100 tiny bulbs strung across the Douglas fir that nearly touched the ceiling. The tree had taken 3 people to carry inside, and it still smelled of the forest, of pine sap and cold mountain air. Beneath it, wrapped packages in red and green and gold paper sat in careful piles, their ribbons catching the light. But nobody was looking at the presents. Every eye in that room was fixed on the old man sitting in the leather armchair by the fireplace, the chair that had molded itself to his shape over 40 years of evenings. Grandpa Joe sat with his hands folded in his lap, his fingers gnarled like the roots of an ancient tree but still strong, still capable of the gentle touch that had dried 1,000 tears and tied 1,000 shoelaces. His sweater was the color of cranberries, hand-knitted by Grandma Rose 3 winters ago, before her hands had started to shake too much to hold the needles steady. The fire crackled and popped beside him, sending shadows dancing across his withered face, across the deep lines that mapped out 87 years of laughter and sorrow and everything in between. The children sat on the floor closest to him, cross-legged on the braided rug that Grandma had made from old clothes, clothes that had belonged to people long gone but not forgotten. Little Emma, only 6 years old, leaned against his knee, her blonde curls still damp from the snow she had been catching on her tongue just an hour before. Her brother Michael, 9 and already trying to act too old for such things, sat beside her, but his eyes were just as wide, just as hungry for the story he knew was coming. Behind them, on the sofa and the love seat and the dining chairs that had been carried in to make room for everyone, sat the rest of the family. Sarah, the children's mother and Grandpa Joe's youngest daughter, had her arm around her husband Tom, and there were tears already gathering in her eyes though the story had not even begun. She knew, somehow, that this would be the last time. Mothers always know these things, feel them in their bones like the coming of a storm. David, the eldest son, sat with his wife Jennifer and their teenage twins, who had put away their phones without being asked, sensing the weight of the moment. Even old Uncle Frank had made the trip from 2 states away, his breathing labored from the stairs but his presence necessary, essential, because some things you simply cannot miss no matter how hard the journey. The smell of turkey still lingered from dinner, mixing with the scent of the apple pie cooling on the kitchen counter and the faint medicinal smell that had started following Grandpa Joe around in recent months, the smell that nobody mentioned but everyone noticed. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking time the way it had for generations, indifferent to the preciousness of each passing second. Grandpa Joe cleared his throat, a sound like distant thunder, and the room fell into a silence so complete that everyone could hear the wind testing the windows, could hear the fire settling into its bed of embers. He reached for the glass of water on the side table, his hand trembling slightly, and took a slow sip. When he set it down, the glass clinked against the wood, and that small sound seemed to echo in the hushed space. "I want to tell you all a story," he began, and his voice was softer than usual, worn thin like an old shirt washed 1,000 times, but still holding together, still serving its purpose. His accent carried the hills of Appalachia where he had been born, the rounded vowels and the gentle rhythm that made every sentence sound like a song. "It is a story I have never told anyone, not even your grandmother, God rest her soul. But tonight feels like the right time. Tonight, with all of you here, with the snow falling and the tree glowing and the smell of Christmas all around us, Tonight I can finally tell it." Emma shifted closer, pressing her small warm body against his leg, and he reached down to rest his hand on her head, his fingers gentle in her curls. Michael leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and around the room, people settled into their seats, pulling blankets over their laps, cradling cups of coffee and cocoa that had gone lukewarm, but nobody cared. "It was Christmas Eve," Grandpa Joe said, "in 1952. I was just 17 years old, barely more than a boy, though I thought I was a man. I thought I knew everything there was to know about the world." His lips curved into a smile that held more sadness than joy. "Lord, how little I understood." The fire popped loudly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and Grandpa Joe watched the flames for a moment, his eyes distant, seeing something that existed only in memory. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, had taken on the quality of someone walking back through time, stepping carefully through the rooms of the past. "We were poor that year," he said. "We had always been poor, but that year was different. That year, the mine had closed, and my father had been out of work for 8 months. 8 long months of watching him grow thinner and quieter, watching the light go out of his eyes a little more each day. My mother took in washing and mending, her fingers raw and bleeding from the lye soap and the needle, working by candlelight long after the rest of us had gone to bed. There were 6 of us children. I was the oldest, and then came Mary, who was 15, and then the twins, John and James, who were 12, and little Sarah, who was 8, and the baby, Thomas, who was only 4 years old." He paused, and his voice grew thick. "Thomas, who had my father's eyes and my mother's smile and who loved Christmas more than anything in the world." Sarah, sitting on the sofa, drew in a sharp breath. She had been named for that long ago aunt, the little girl in the story, though she had never known why until this moment. Her hand found her husband's and squeezed tight. "That Christmas Eve," Grandpa Joe continued, "we had nothing. No money for presents, no money for a proper Christmas dinner. We had a chicken, scrawny and tough, that my mother had been saving, and some potatoes from the root cellar, and that was all. The tree in our front room was a pine branch that I had cut from the woods, stuck in a bucket of stones to hold it upright. We had strung it with paper chains that little Sarah had made from old newspaper, cutting and pasting with a concentration that made her tongue stick out the corner of her mouth." He smiled at the memory, and for a moment he looked younger, the years falling away like snow sliding off a roof. "But Thomas," he said, "Thomas kept asking about Santa Claus. He wanted to know if Santa would come even though we had been so poor, even though we had no chimney for him to climb down, just a stove pipe that poked through the roof of our little cabin. He wanted to know if Santa knew where we lived, way up in the hills, far from town, far from everyone. My mother would hold him and tell him that Santa always knew where the good children were, that Santa never forgot anyone. But I could see the pain in her eyes, the knowledge that come morning, there would be nothing under that pitiful branch, nothing to make a 4-year-old boy's face light up with joy. And I could see my father sitting in his chair by the stove, staring at nothing, his hands hanging loose between his knees, defeated. The room was so quiet now that the sound of breathing seemed loud, seemed to fill the space between the words. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and their frames, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent. "I could not stand it," Grandpa Joe said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I could not stand the thought of Thomas waking up on Christmas morning to nothing. So that afternoon, when the sun was already starting to sink behind the mountains and the temperature was dropping fast, I put on my coat and my boots and I told my mother I was going to check the snares, see if we had caught any rabbits. She looked at me with those eyes that saw everything, that knew I was lying, but she just nodded and told me to be careful, to be back before dark. I think she knew what I was planning, though I had not said a word. Mothers always know. He took another sip of water, and his hand shook more noticeably this time. Emma reached up and patted his knee, a gesture of comfort from someone too young to understand but old enough to feel. He smiled down at her, and a single tear tracked down his withered cheek, catching the firelight. "I walked into town," he said. "It was 5 miles down the mountain, 5 miles on a road that was barely more than a path, frozen hard and treacherous. The wind cut through my coat like it was made of paper, and my breath came out in clouds that froze in my eyebrows and my hair. My feet went numb after the first mile, but I kept walking, kept putting one foot in front of the other, because I had a plan. There was a store in town, a general store run by a man named Mr. Henderson. He was not a kind man, not particularly, but he was fair, and he had a toy section, a small corner of the store where he kept things for children. Wooden trains and rag dolls and tin soldiers and picture books. I had seen them through the window many times, had pressed my nose to the cold glass and imagined what it would be like to walk in and buy something, anything. Grandpa Joe's voice grew even softer, and everyone leaned in, straining to hear. "I had $2, he said. $2 that I had earned doing odd jobs over the past year, $2 that I had hidden in a tin can under a loose board in the floor of the cabin. It was supposed to be for something important, for an emergency, but what could be more important than the light in a little boy's eyes on Christmas morning? When I got to town, the sun was almost gone, and the street lights were coming on, casting pools of yellow light on the snow-covered sidewalks. The store windows were decorated with garlands and bells, and I could hear singing coming from the church at the end of the street, people practicing carols for the midnight service. The smell of wood smoke hung in the air, and somewhere someone was baking bread, and the combination made my stomach clench with hunger. I went into Henderson's store, and the bell above the door jingled, bright and cheerful. The warmth hit me like a wall, and suddenly I could feel my face again, could feel the painful tingling as my frozen skin began to thaw. Mr. Henderson looked up from behind the counter, his spectacles sliding down his nose, and he frowned when he saw me. "You are dripping on my floor, boy," he said, and his voice was sharp, annoyed. I looked down and saw that the snow on my boots was melting, creating small puddles on the clean wooden planks. I mumbled an apology and moved toward the toy corner, my boots squeaking with each step. "There were so many things," Grandpa Joe said, his eyes distant again, seeing that long-ago store. Toys I had never imagined, toys that seemed like treasures from a fairy tale. But they all had price tags, and as I looked at each one, my heart sank lower and lower. The wooden train that I knew Thomas would love was $3. The tin soldiers were $2.50. Even the smallest rag doll was $1.75. I stood there in that corner, feeling the warmth of the store and the cold of failure settling into my bones, and I wanted to cry. I was 17 years old, nearly a man, and I wanted to cry like a child. Because I had walked 5 miles in the freezing cold, and I had brought every penny I had in the world, and it was not enough. It was never going to be enough. Mr. Henderson came over, his footsteps heavy on the floor, and he looked down at me with those cold eyes behind his spectacles. "You planning on buying something, boy, or just looking?" he asked. I told him I wanted to buy a present for my little brother, for Christmas. I told him I had $2. He snorted, a sound of derision that made my face burn with shame. $2 will not buy much, he said. Maybe a bag of marbles. Maybe a stick of peppermint. He gestured at the toys around us. These are for people with real money. Grandpa Joe's voice had gone hard, remembering the humiliation, and around the room, people shifted uncomfortably, feeling the echo of that old pain. But then his expression softened, and he shook his head slowly. I was about to leave, he said, about to walk back out into the cold with my $2 still in my pocket and my heart broken into pieces, when I heard a voice from the back of the store. A woman's voice, soft and kind, like warm honey. Now, Henry Henderson, the voice said, is that any way to talk to a customer on Christmas Eve? I turned and saw her coming toward us, and I swear to you, even now, 73 years later, I can see her as clearly as I see all of you sitting here. She was old, maybe 60 or 70, with white hair pulled back in a bun and eyes the color of a summer sky. She wore a simple dress, dark blue with a white collar, and an apron that had flour dusted across the front. She was wiping her hands on a dish towel, and she was smiling at me, a smile that made me feel like I mattered, like I was important. Mr. Henderson turned to her, and his voice changed, became almost respectful. This is just a boy from up in the hills, Mrs. Abernathy, he said. He does not have enough money for anything worthwhile. Mrs. Abernathy, Grandpa Joe said, and his voice was full of wonder, as if he still could not quite believe what had happened. She came over to me and looked at the toys, and then she looked at me, really looked at me, seeing past the worn coat and the wet boots and the red, chapped hands. She saw me. "What is your brother's name?" she asked, and her voice was so gentle that I felt something crack open inside my chest. I told her his name was Thomas, and that he was 4 years old, and that he loved animals and stories and anything that made noise. She nodded, thoughtful, and then she reached up to a high shelf and took down a wooden horse. It was beautiful, carved from some light-colored wood and painted with care, with a real horsehair mane and tail and a leather saddle. It had wheels on its feet so it could be pulled along, and when she set it on the floor and gave it a gentle push, it rolled smoothly, silently. "This," she said, "would be perfect for Thomas. Do you not think so?" I looked at the horse, and I looked at the price tag hanging from its neck, and my heart, which had just started to hope, plummeted again. The tag said $5. $5. I might as well have needed 500. "I only have $2, I whispered, and I hated how small my voice sounded, how defeated. Mrs. Abernathy looked at the tag, and then she looked at Mr. Henderson, and something passed between them, some silent communication that I did not understand. "Henry," she said, and her voice was firm now, had steel beneath the honey, "I believe this horse is on sale. Christmas Eve special. $2 exactly." Mr. Henderson opened his mouth, and I could see him wanting to argue, wanting to say that there was no such sale, that she could not just change the prices on a whim. But something in her eyes stopped him, some force of will that was stronger than his greed. He closed his mouth and nodded, once, sharp and reluctant. $2, he muttered. Highway robbery, but $2. Grandpa Joe's voice broke, and he had to stop, had to take a moment to compose himself. The room waited, patient, understanding. When he continued, tears were flowing freely down his face, and he made no move to wipe them away. "I gave him my $2, he said, and he wrapped the horse in brown paper and tied it with string, his movements rough and hurried, like he wanted to be done with the whole transaction. But Mrs. Abernathy, she took the package from him and she added a ribbon, a red ribbon that she tied in a careful bow. And then she reached into a jar on the counter and pulled out 2 peppermint sticks, the kind with the red and white stripes, and she tucked them into the package. For you and Thomas, she said. to share on Christmas morning. I tried to thank her, tried to find words big enough to hold what I was feeling, but nothing came out right. Everything I said sounded stupid and small. She just patted my hand, her skin warm and soft, and she told me to get home safe, to give Thomas a hug from her. I walked out of that store with the package clutched to my chest, and the cold did not touch me. The 5 miles back up the mountain felt like nothing, like I was floating, like my feet barely touched the ground. The stars were out by then, millions of them scattered across the black sky, so bright and close it felt like I could reach up and pluck them down. The moon was full, turning the snow blue white, and the world was so beautiful it hurt. When I got home, everyone was already in bed, the cabin dark except for the glow of the dying fire in the stove. I hid the package under my cot, under the thin blanket that served as my mattress, and I lay there in the dark, listening to my brother's breathing, listening to the wind outside, and I felt rich. Richer than Mr. Henderson with his store full of goods, richer than anyone in the world. Christmas morning came cold and clear, the sun rising over the mountains and painting the snow pink and gold. Thomas woke first, the way he always did, bouncing on the beds and shouting that it was Christmas, that Santa had come. My mother came out of the bedroom she shared with my father, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face tired but trying to smile. My father followed, moving slowly, like an old man though he was only 42. We gathered around that pitiful pine branch, and my mother gave each of us an orange, a single orange that she had somehow managed to save for, and we held them like they were made of gold. The twins got new socks that my mother had knitted, and Mary got a hair ribbon, and little Sarah got a rag doll that my mother had sewn from scraps. They were small things, humble things, but they were given with love, and that made them precious. And then I brought out the package, the brown paper with the red ribbon, and I gave it to Thomas. His eyes went wide, so wide I thought they might swallow his whole face, and his hands shook as he tore at the paper. When he saw the horse, he made a sound, a gasp of pure joy, and he hugged it to his chest and started to cry. My mother looked at me, and I saw the question in her eyes, saw her wondering where I had gotten the money, if I had done something foolish or dangerous. But I just smiled at her and shook my head, and she understood that it was all right, that I had done what I needed to do. My father, he put his hand on my shoulder, and he squeezed, and that squeeze said more than 1,000 words could have said. It said thank you. It said I am proud of you. It said you are a man now, a good man. Thomas played with that horse all day, pulling it around the cabin, making clip-clop sounds with his tongue, and venting elaborate stories about where the horse was going and what adventures it was having. He named it Star, because of the white mark on its forehead, and he slept with it that night, his arms wrapped around it, his face peaceful and happy. Grandpa Joe stopped, and the silence stretched out, heavy with emotion. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing red in the darkness, and outside, the snow had stopped falling. The world felt suspended, held in the palm of something larger than itself. That was not the end of the story, Grandpa Joe said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. That was just the beginning. He shifted in his chair, and the leather creaked, a familiar sound that was part of the fabric of this house, part of the memories that lived in its walls. Emma had fallen asleep against his leg, her breathing deep and even, but everyone else was wide awake, leaning forward, waiting. 3 days after Christmas, he said, I went back into town. I had to know who Mrs. Abernathy was, had to thank her properly, had to tell her what her kindness had meant. I asked around, described her to people, the white hair and the blue eyes and the flower on her apron. But nobody knew who I was talking about. Nobody had ever heard of anyone named Mrs. Abernathy. I went to Henderson's store, and when I asked him about her, he looked at me like I had lost my mind. "There is no Mrs. Abernathy," he said. "There never has been. You came in here alone, bought that horse, and left. That is all that happened." "But I saw her," I insisted. "I talked to her. She made you lower the price." He just shook his head and told me I must have been confused, must have imagined it, must have been lightheaded from the cold and the walk. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had experienced. I asked other people who had been in the store that day, people who might have seen her. But everyone said the same thing. There had been no woman. There had been no Mrs. Abernathy. I had been alone in that store with Mr. Henderson, and I had bought the horse for $2 because Henderson had been in a generous mood, which was so unlike him that people were still talking about it weeks later. Grandpa Joe looked around the room, his eyes moving from face to face, and his expression was one of wonder mixed with something that might have been fear or might have been awe. "I never told anyone," he said. "I kept it to myself all these years, because I knew how it sounded. I knew people would think I was crazy, or lying, or making up stories. But I know what I saw. I know who helped me that day." The room was utterly still. Even the fire seemed to have stopped crackling, as if it too was listening, waiting for what came next. Outside, a church bell began to toll in the distance, marking the hour, and the sound drifted through the cold night air like a benediction. "Thomas kept that horse for years," Grandpa Joe continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He took it everywhere, played with it until the paint wore off and the wheels got wobbly and the mane and tail were thin and patchy. When he got older, when he outgrew toys, he kept it on a shelf in his room, and sometimes I would catch him holding it, running his fingers over the worn wood, smiling at some memory." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was so soft that people had to strain to hear. "Thomas died in Korea," he said. 1953. He was 19 years old. A bullet to the chest, they told us. He died instantly, did not suffer. As if that made it better. As if anything could make it better. Sarah made a small sound, a gasp of pain, and her husband pulled her closer. Around the room, people were crying openly now, tears streaming down faces, hands reaching for tissues or sleeves or each other. When they sent his things home, Grandpa Joe said, there was not much. Some letters, some photographs, his dog tags. And the horse. He had taken it with him, carried it in his pack all the way across the ocean, all the way to that frozen hillside where he died. It was with him at the end. He reached down beside his chair, and everyone watched as he picked up a small wooden box that had been sitting there all along, unnoticed. His hand shook as he opened it, and he lifted out something wrapped in soft cloth. Slowly, carefully, he unwrapped it, and there it was. The horse. Worn and faded, the paint almost completely gone, the mane and tail sparse, the wheels cracked with age. But still beautiful. Still precious. "This," he said, holding it up so everyone could see, "this is what love looks like. This is what kindness looks like. This is what Christmas is supposed to be about. Not the presents or the decorations or the fancy dinners. But this. The willingness to give everything you have to bring joy to someone else. The mysterious grace that appears when we need it most. The way a simple gift can carry someone through their whole life, can give them comfort even in their darkest hour." He looked down at the horse, and his tears fell on the worn wood, darkening it. "I have carried this with me ever since," he said. "Carried it and the memory of that Christmas, the memory of Mrs. Abernathy, whoever or whatever she was. Angel or ghost or just a kind woman whose name I got wrong, it does not matter. What matters is that she saw a desperate boy trying to do something good, and she helped him. She made a miracle happen. And Thomas, he whispered, Thomas carried it with him too. Carried it into war, carried it into death. Because it reminded him that he was loved. That he mattered. That somewhere, someone had sacrificed for him, had walked 5 miles in the freezing cold and given up everything they had just to see him smile. Grandpa Joe carefully wrapped the horse back in its cloth and placed it back in the box. He closed the lid with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silent room. When he looked up, his face was wet with tears, but he was smiling, a smile of such profound sadness and such profound joy that it was almost painful to see. I am telling you this now, he said, because I want you to understand something. I want you to know that the gifts we give, the sacrifices we make, they matter. They ripple out through time in ways we cannot imagine. That $2 I spent 73 years ago, it bought more than a toy. It bought hope. It bought love. It bought a memory that sustained a little boy through his whole short life. And Mrs. Abernathy, whoever she was, her kindness did not just help me buy a horse. It taught me what it means to be human. It taught me that sometimes we are called to do things that do not make sense, that are not practical, that might even seem foolish. But we do them anyway, because love is not practical. Grace is not sensible. Miracles do not follow the rules. He looked around the room, his gaze touching each person, lingering, memorizing. I am 87 years old, he said. I have lived a long life, a good life. I have seen joy and sorrow, triumph and tragedy. I have held my children when they were born and buried my parents and my brother and my wife. I have worked hard and loved deeply and tried, always tried, to be the kind of person Mrs. Abernathy saw in me that day. The kind of person who gives everything for the people they love. And now, he said softly, now I am tired. So very tired. But I am not afraid. Because I know that when my time comes, when I close my eyes for the last time, Thomas will be there waiting for me. And he will have that horse, and it will be new again, perfect again, the way it was that Christmas morning when his face lit up with joy. And Mrs. Abernathy will be there too, and I will finally be able to thank her properly, to tell her what her kindness meant, what it has meant all these years. The clock in the hallway struck midnight, the chimes ringing out clear and pure, and as if on cue, the church bells in town began to ring, calling people to the Christmas service. The sound floated through the night, through the snow-covered streets and the quiet houses, a sound of celebration and hope and ancient promises kept. Grandpa Joe reached down and gently shook Emma awake. She stirred, blinking up at him with sleepy eyes, and he smiled at her. Merry Christmas, little one, he whispered. Remember this night. Remember this story. And when you are old, when you have grandchildren of your own, tell them. Tell them about the wooden horse and the mysterious woman and the boy who walked 5 miles in the snow for love. Emma nodded, not fully understanding but sensing the importance, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and hugged him tight. Around the room, people were standing, moving toward him, wanting to touch him, to hold him, to somehow keep him there with them forever. But everyone knew, in that deep place where truth lives, that this was goodbye. This was his gift to them, this story, this piece of his heart laid bare. Sarah knelt beside his chair, taking his hand in both of hers, and she pressed it to her cheek. Daddy, she said, and her voice broke on the word. Thank you. Thank you for telling us. Thank you for everything." He cupped her face with his other hand, his thumb brushing away her tears. "You were named for her, you know," he said. "For little Sarah, my sister. She lived to be 92 years old, had 6 children and 14 grandchildren and more great-grandchildren than anyone could count. She became a teacher, spent her whole life helping children learn to read and write and dream. And she always said that the best Christmas she ever had was that one, when we had nothing but each other and a scrawny chicken and a pine branch and a wooden horse." He looked at David, his eldest son, who stood with his hand on his wife's shoulder, his face wet with tears. "You take care of them," he said. "You be the kind of man who walks 5 miles in the snow. You be the kind of man who gives everything for the people he loves." David nodded, unable to speak, and Grandpa Joe smiled. "And you," he said, looking at the teenagers, at Michael trying so hard to be brave, at all the young faces gathered around him. "You remember that things do not matter. Stuff does not matter. What matters is love. What matters is showing up. What matters is being willing to sacrifice, to give, to help, even when it is hard, even when it costs you everything you have." The fire had gone out completely now, leaving only ash and the faint smell of smoke. The Christmas tree lights seemed brighter in the darkness, casting colored shadows on the walls, red and green and gold and blue. Outside, the world was silent, blanketed in snow, peaceful and still. It was the kind of silence that feels holy, that feels like the earth itself is holding its breath. Grandpa Joe leaned back in his chair, and he looked tired, more tired than anyone had ever seen him. But he also looked peaceful, looked like a man who had laid down a burden he had been carrying for too long. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they were clear, focused, present. "I love you all," he said simply. "More than words can say. You have been my joy, my purpose, my reason for getting up every morning. You have made my life worth living. And when I am gone, when you gather here for Christmas and I am not in this chair, I want you to remember this night. I want you to remember that I am not really gone. I am in every act of kindness you do, every sacrifice you make, every time you choose love over convenience, generosity over greed, hope over despair." He picked up the wooden box and held it out to Sarah. "This is yours now," he said. "Keep it safe. Pass it down. Let it remind you, remind all of you, that miracles are real. That grace exists. That sometimes, when we need it most, angels walk among us wearing flour-dusted aprons and smiling with eyes the color of summer sky." Sarah took the box, cradling it like it was made of glass, like it held something infinitely precious, which it did. She opened it and looked at the worn wooden horse, and she could see it all, could see the 17-year-old boy walking through the snow, could see the 4-year-old child's face lighting up with joy, could see the 19-year-old soldier carrying it into war, carrying it into death. She could see the thread of love that connected them all, that connected past and present and future, that made them all part of something larger than themselves. "Thank you," she whispered. "We will keep it safe. We will remember." The family stayed there for a long time, gathered around Grandpa Joe's chair, touching him, holding him, memorizing the feel of his hand, the sound of his voice, the smell of his cranberry sweater, and the faint scent of the peppermint candies he always kept in his pocket. They stayed until the clock struck 1, until the church bells had long since fallen silent, until the candles on the mantel had burned down to stubs. And when they finally went to bed, moving slowly through the dark house, they carried the story with them. They carried it into their dreams, where it mixed with their own memories, their own Christmases, their own moments of grace and miracle. They carried it into their hearts, where it would live forever, a light in the darkness, a reminder of what truly matters. Grandpa Joe died 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning when the sun was shining and the snow had melted enough to see the brown grass underneath. He went peacefully, in his sleep, with a smile on his face, and when they found him, his hand was reaching out, as if he was taking someone's hand, as if someone had come to walk with him into whatever comes next. The funeral was large, filled with people whose lives he had touched, people who had stories of their own about his kindness, his generosity, his willingness to help anyone who needed it. But the family knew that the real memorial had happened that Christmas Eve, in the living room with the fire burning and the tree glowing and the snow falling outside. That had been his goodbye, his final gift, the story that would outlive him and carry his love forward through the generations. Sarah kept the wooden horse on her mantle, in a place of honor, and every Christmas she would take it down and tell the story to her children, and later to her grandchildren. She would tell it the way Grandpa Joe had told it, with all the details, all the emotion, all the love. And every time she told it, people would cry, would feel something shift inside them, would understand a little better what it means to be human, to be kind, to be willing to give everything for the people you love. Years passed, and the story spread. The grandchildren told their friends, who told their parents, who told their co-workers. It became a legend in the family, the story of the wooden horse and the mysterious woman and the boy who walked 5 miles in the snow. And every time it was told, it changed someone, touched someone, reminded someone that miracles are real and grace exists and love is the only thing that truly matters. Emma, who had fallen asleep against Grandpa Joe's knee that night, grew up to be a nurse. She spent her life caring for people in their most vulnerable moments, holding their hands, easing their pain, being present in their suffering. And she always said that she learned how to do that from Grandpa Joe, from the way he had told his story with such honesty and vulnerability, from the way he had shown them all that it is okay to be broken, okay to hurt, okay to need help. That asking for help and accepting grace is not weakness but wisdom. Michael became a teacher, like his great-aunt Sarah before him. He taught history, but really he taught about humanity, about the choices people make and the ripples those choices create through time. And every Christmas, he would tell his students about the wooden horse, about the boy and the mysterious woman and the soldier who carried a toy into war. He would tell them that history is not just about dates and battles and treaties. It is about moments like that, small moments that change everything, that reveal what we are capable of when we choose love over fear. David, Grandpa Joe's son, lived another 30 years after his father died. He worked hard, provided for his family, and tried every day to be the kind of man who walks 5 miles in the snow. He was not perfect, made mistakes, had regrets. But he showed up. He gave. He sacrificed. And when he was old and dying, surrounded by his own children and grandchildren, he told them the story one more time, his voice weak but steady, his eyes bright with tears and memory. And Sarah, who had been given the wooden horse, who had cradled it in her hands that Christmas Eve and promised to keep it safe, she lived to be 94 years old. She saw the world change in ways that would have been unimaginable to the 17-year-old boy walking through the snow in 1952. She saw computers and cell phones and the internet. She saw wars end and new wars begin. She saw her children grow and her grandchildren grow and her great-grandchildren born. But through all of it, through all the changes and the chaos and the noise, she kept the wooden horse. She kept it in the story it carried, the story of love and sacrifice and mysterious grace. And on her last Christmas, when she was too weak to leave her bed, when her family gathered around her the way they had gathered around Grandpa Joe all those years ago, she asked them to bring her the box. They opened it carefully, reverently, and they lifted out the horse. It was even more worn now, the wood smooth from decades of handling, the wheels barely attached, the mane and tail almost completely gone. But it was still beautiful. Still precious. Still a miracle. Sarah held it in her trembling hands, and she smiled, a smile that lit up her whole face despite the pain, despite the weakness, despite the knowledge that this was goodbye. She looked at each person in the room, her gaze lingering, memorizing, loving. "Tell the story," she whispered. "Never stop telling the story. Because as long as the story lives, he lives. They all live. Thomas and Grandpa Joe and Mrs. Abernathy and everyone who ever chose love over fear, grace over judgment, giving over keeping. Tell the story, and keep the miracle alive." And they promised. They promised through their tears, through their grief, through their love. They promised to tell the story, to pass it down, to keep it alive. And they have kept that promise. The story has been told at weddings and funerals, at birthday parties and graduations, at quiet moments around kitchen tables and loud moments around campfires. It has been told to strangers and friends, to believers and skeptics, to anyone who will listen. And every time it is told, something happens. Something shifts. People remember what matters. They remember that stuff is just stuff, that money is just money, that the only thing we take with us when we leave this world is the love we gave and the love we received. They remember that sometimes angels walk among us, that grace appears when we need it most, that miracles are real if we have eyes to see them. The wooden horse still exists, passed down through the generations, kept safe in its box, brought out every Christmas to be held and admired and remembered. It sits now in the home of Sarah's great-granddaughter, a young woman named Rose after Grandma Rose, who never knew Grandpa Joe but who carries his story in her heart like a treasure. Rose is 25 years old, working 2 jobs, struggling to make ends meet, living in a tiny apartment in a city far from the mountains where Grandpa Joe was born. But every Christmas, she takes out the wooden horse, and she tells the story to anyone who will listen. She tells it to her roommates and her coworkers and the elderly neighbor who lives alone down the hall. She tells it because it reminds her that she is part of something larger than herself, part of a chain of love that stretches back through time and will stretch forward into a future she cannot imagine. And last Christmas, something happened that Rose will never forget, something that made her believe, truly believe, in the mystery and magic that Grandpa Joe had spoken of all those years ago. She was working at a soup kitchen on Christmas Eve, serving dinner to people who had nowhere else to go, people who were hungry and cold and alone. The work was hard, the kitchen was hot, and she was exhausted, running on too little sleep and too much coffee. Near the end of the evening, an old woman came in, the last person in line. She had white hair pulled back in a bun and eyes the color of a summer sky, and she wore a simple dark blue dress with a white collar. She smiled at Rose, a smile that made Rose feel seen, really seen, in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. "Thank you for being here," the woman said, her voice soft and kind, like warm honey. "Thank you for giving your time, your energy, your love. You are doing important work." Rose served her a plate of food, and as she did, she noticed that the woman's hands were dusted with flour, as if she had been baking. They talked for a few minutes, about nothing and everything, about Christmas and kindness and the importance of showing up. And then the woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wooden carving, a tiny horse no bigger than Rose's thumb. "For you," the woman said, pressing it into Rose's hand. to remind you that miracles are real, that grace exists, that you are part of something beautiful. Rose looked down at the carving, and when she looked up again, the woman was gone. Simply gone, as if she had never been there at all. Rose asked the other volunteers if they had seen where the old woman went, but nobody remembered seeing her. Nobody remembered an old woman with white hair and blue eyes at all. Rose went home that night with the tiny horse clutched in her hand, and she took out the wooden box and opened it and looked at the worn horse inside. And she understood, in a way that went beyond words, beyond logic, that the story was not just a story. It was a truth. It was a promise. It was a reminder that we are never alone, that grace is always available, that miracles happen to those who are willing to see them. She keeps the tiny horse on a chain around her neck now, wearing it every day, feeling its weight against her heart. And when people ask about it, she tells them the story. She tells them about Grandpa Joe and the wooden horse and Mrs. Abernathy and the mysterious grace that appears when we need it most. She tells them about the 17-year-old boy who walked 5 miles in the snow and the 4-year-old child who carried a toy into war and the old man who told his last Christmas story with tears streaming down his face. And people listen. They always listen. Because it is a story that speaks to something deep inside all of us, something that knows, even when we try to forget, that love is real and grace exists and miracles happen every single day if we have eyes to see them and hearts open enough to receive them. The wooden horse is old now, so old that it is a wonder it has survived at all. The wood is cracked and faded, the wheels are loose, the mane and tail are gone. But it is still here, still being passed down, still carrying its story forward through time. And as long as it exists, as long as people tell the story, Grandpa Joe lives. Thomas lives. Mrs. Abernathy lives. They all live in the hearts of everyone who hears the tale and understands its truth. Because that is what stories do. They keep people alive. They carry love forward through the generations. They remind us of who we are and who we can be. They show us that our choices matter, that our actions ripple out through time in ways we cannot imagine, that a single act of kindness can change the world. And so the story continues, told and retold, changing slightly with each telling but always keeping its essential truth. The truth that love is stronger than death. That grace is more powerful than despair. That miracles are real and angels walk among us, and sometimes, when we need it most, help appears in the most unexpected ways. The truth that we are all connected, all part of the same story, all threads in the same tapestry. That what we do matters. That who we are matters. That the sacrifices we make and the love we give and the kindness we show, all of it matters, all of it counts, all of it echoes through eternity. And on Christmas Eve, in homes all over the world, and living rooms lit by tree lights and warmed by fires, and kitchens smelling of cinnamon and pine, and quiet moments between the chaos and the celebration, people tell the story. They tell it to their children and their grandchildren. They tell it to their friends and their neighbors. They tell it to strangers who need to hear it, who need to be reminded that they are not alone, that grace exists, that miracles are real. They tell it with tears in their eyes and love in their hearts, and as they tell it, something happens. The room grows quieter. The air grows thicker. Time seems to slow down, to stretch out, to become something more than just seconds ticking past. And for a moment, just a moment, everyone in that room can feel it. Can feel the presence of something larger than themselves. Can feel the weight of all the love that has been given and received, all the sacrifices that have been made, all the grace that has been extended. They can feel Grandpa Joe sitting in his leather chair by the fire, his hand gentle on a child's head, his voice soft and worn and full of love. They can feel Thomas, 4 years old and clutching a wooden horse, his face lit up with joy. They can feel Mrs. Abernathy, whoever or whatever she was, smiling with eyes the color of summer sky, extending grace to a desperate boy in a general store on Christmas Eve. They can feel all of it, all at once, the whole beautiful, terrible, miraculous story of what it means to be human. To love and lose and love again. To give and sacrifice and keep giving. To believe in miracles even when the world tells us to be practical, to be sensible, to protect ourselves. And in that moment, they understand. They understand what Grandpa Joe was trying to tell them that last Christmas Eve, what he had been trying to tell them his whole life. That this is what we are here for. This is our purpose. Not to accumulate stuff or achieve success or protect ourselves from pain, but to love, to give, to show up, to be willing to walk 5 miles in the snow for the people we care about, to extend grace to strangers, to believe in miracles, to keep the story alive. And so they do. They keep the story alive. They pass it down. They tell it to anyone who will listen. And with each telling, the miracle happens again. Hearts open. Tears fall. People remember what matters. And somewhere, in some place beyond our understanding, Grandpa Joe smiles. Thomas clutches his wooden horse. Mrs. Abernathy nods with satisfaction. Because the story lives. The love lives. The grace lives. And it will keep living, as long as there are people willing to tell it, willing to listen, willing to believe that miracles are real and grace exists and love is the only thing that truly matters. It will keep living through the generations, through the centuries, through all the changes and challenges and chaos that the future will bring. Because some stories are more than just stories. Some stories are truth. Some stories are love made visible. Some stories are miracles wrapped in words, passed from heart to heart, generation to generation, keeping alive the best of what it means to be human. This is one of those stories. The story of the wooden horse and the mysterious woman and the boy who walked 5 miles in the snow. The story of Grandpa Joe's last Christmas, when he gave his family the greatest gift he had to give. Not a thing, not an object, but a piece of his heart. A memory. A truth. A reminder that we are all connected, all loved, all part of something beautiful and eternal. And now, as this story comes to its end, as the words wind down and the silence returns, there is one more thing to say. One more truth to speak. One more reminder to give. You are part of this story now. You, who have listened, who have felt the tears gather in your eyes, who have remembered your own Christmases, your own moments of grace, your own wooden horses. You are part of the chain now, part of the love that stretches back through time and forward into the future. And you have a choice. You can let this story end here, can let it fade from your memory like so many other things you have heard and forgotten. Or you can keep it alive. You can tell it to someone else. You can let it change you, shape you, remind you of what matters. You can be the person who walks 5 miles in the snow. You can be the person who extends grace to a stranger. You can be the person who believes in miracles. You can be part of the story, part of the love, part of the grace, part of the miracle. And if you choose that, if you choose to keep the story alive, to let it live in your heart and guide your actions and shape your choices, then Grandpa Joe's gift will continue. The wooden horse will keep rolling forward through time. Mrs. Abernathy will keep appearing when she is needed most. And the love that started with a 17-year-old boy walking through the snow on Christmas Eve in 1952 will keep growing, keep spreading, keep changing the world one heart at a time. That is the power of story. That is the power of love. That is the power of grace. It does not end. It does not die. It just keeps going, keeps growing, keeps transforming everything it touches. So tell the story. Remember the story. Live the story. Be the kind of person who gives everything for the people they love. Be the kind of person who extends grace to strangers. Be the kind of person who believes in miracles even when the world tells you to be practical. Be the kind of person Grandpa Joe was. The kind of person Mrs. Abernathy was. The kind of person Thomas was, carrying a wooden horse into war because it reminded him that he was loved. Be that person. And in being that person, keep the miracle alive. Because that is what Christmas is really about. Not the presents or the decorations or the fancy dinners. But the love, the grace, the willingness to sacrifice, the belief in miracles, the understanding that we are all connected, all part of the same story, all threads in the same beautiful, terrible, miraculous tapestry of human existence. That is what Grandpa Joe understood. That is what he tried to teach his family that last Christmas Eve, sitting in his leather chair by the fire, holding a worn wooden horse and crying tears of joy and sorrow and love. That is what he gave them, his final gift, more precious than gold, more lasting than any material thing. He gave them the truth. He gave them the story. He gave them the miracle. And now that gift is yours. What you do with it is up to you.